Thank you all for joining us for this She Recovers Mental Health Monday. We've been holding these sessions every Monday since the first Monday in May. And we're always delighted to be able to bring you all sorts of wonderful content, interesting and informative, educational. And today we're excited to have our friend, I was gonna say our old friend, but that wouldn't have sounded very nice. Our dear friend, Darlene Lancer here with us. Darlene Lancer is a licensed marriage and family therapist and expert author on relationships and codependency. She's counseled individuals and couples for 30 years and coaches internationally. Her books include Conquering Shame and Codependency, 8 Steps to Freeing the True You, and Codependency for Dummies. She also has 7 ebooks, including 10 Steps to Self-Esteem, How to Speak Your Mind, Become Assertive and Set Limits, Dealing with a Narcissist, 8 Steps to Raise Self-Esteem and Set Boundaries with Difficult People, I'm Not Perfect, I'm Only Human, How to Beat Perfectionism, and Freedom from Guilt and Blame, Finding Self-Forgiveness. All of her books are available on Amazon, other online booksellers, and her website, www.whatiscodependency.com. If you visit her website, you can get a free copy of 14 Tips for Letting Go. Darlene is a sought-after speaker in media and at professional conferences. And we're just delighted to have you here. Darlene was with us as a panelist on one of our panels at She Recovers in LA at Beverly Hilton in May 2018, just over 2 years ago. It feels like 10 or 20 years ago. And Darlene, I just want you to know that in our community, where we meet at least twice a day online, we are ripe with codependence. So we have a lot of codependency, as you know, particularly in the field of recovery. The question is often asked, what comes first, codependency or the maladaptive behavior? What kind of leads to what? And although I don't think we can answer that question necessarily today, we really look forward to hearing and learning more about codependency from somebody who's made that her life's work. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to you for any other introductory comments you want to make and for you to start sharing your screen.
I just want to thank you so much, because what you've done is phenomenal. I remember when you first started She Recovers and we were sharing some of our own experience, and so this is amazing how it's grown, and it's a delight to be able to share to your audience. Codependency go together. It's kind of why I wrote this book on conquering shame and codependency, and I'm going to be talking about how they interact. So just to get some definitions aside, there is no collective consensus definition of codependency, but I think this is the one that I thought a lot about it. It really captures what it is, because it doesn't matter if you're in a relationship or not. You're codependent if you can't function from your innate self, and your thinking and behavior organizes around another person, a drug or a substance or a process. And so that includes addicts. They're codependent with their drug of choice, and then once they get abstinent or free of their addiction, then they have to deal with the underlying codependency. So here's a diagram of the self, and you can see it's surrounded by this shell that clouds the self. That's shame-based. The part of when we think of ourselves as inferior, inadequate, all the negative things we think about ourselves privately, or some of us don't even allow ourselves to acknowledge that, it's all unconscious. And then there's the persona that we show to the world. And for codependence, it's usually the codependent personality. Beyond that is our ideal self, our perfect self, that we think we should never be angry, that we should be all loving and spiritual, or giving, or achieving, or famous, whatever that might be. And then we're always comparing ourselves to that ideal and falling short. So perfectionism is a symptom. Not every codependent is perfectionistic, but if you're perfectionistic, there's shame underneath that. And that's why I wrote a book on that. All my ebooks address some of the symptoms. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the difference between shame and codependency. So, between shame and guilt. And guilt is when we've done something wrong, and shame is when we think that we're the mistake. And guilt is a goes along with shame. So if you have toxic shame, you're going to feel guilty a lot. I wrote a blog about, is your guilt true or false? Because codependents have a lot of irrational guilt. They feel guilty for other people's feelings. They feel guilty for other people's behaviors even. And when they feel guilty, right away it goes into shame. It's not just that I made a mistake or I'm embarrassed about something that I did. It's then becomes that there's something wrong with me. Why did I do that? And shame actually can lead to positive behavior. It leads to making amends, leads you to make self-improvement. It's more externally focused on what you've done to someone else. It's more of a moral emotion, whereas shame is, the focus is internal, and it promotes people to withdraw and to hide, and it leads to egocentricity. And one of the defenses to shame is rage and aggression. You feel hopeless, like you feel irredeemable. There's nothing I can do. Whereas with guilt, you can always make amends. And it leads to increasing your self-esteem, as a matter of fact. And one of the beauties of 12-step programs is that it can convert shame in two ways. One, by sharing. So we're sharing our shame, so we're connecting. And when it's shared and other people nod, and you realize that you're not the only one, you're not an alien, and people understand, and you share this with a sponsor. And then you make amends so that your shame can turn into guilt, then you can let go of it and join the human race again. So it's very healing in that sense. And my ebook about freedom from guilt includes cognitive, behavioral, and spiritual, and the 12 steps, psychological, all approaches to overcoming guilt. So in fact,
Darlene, and I just want to jump in. Sorry, I won't normally do this, but just to make the clarification for our audience, what you're saying, I love this, the idea of the guilt versus shame, but also that I would claim that you can also do some of the same things with the sharing and making amends, recognizing outside of 12-step groups, just so that our audience realizes that you're using that as an example. It's not the entirety of what you're talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. You can share with a friend. Sometimes when I feel that I've really done something awful, I'll talk to a friend and they think, well, they don't think anything of it. Or a therapist, of course. So, and guilt doesn't lead to psychological problems. Healthy guilt versus irrational guilt that's based in shame. But shame can lead to eating disorders, PTSD, aggression, as I said, anxiety, and depression. And some of the beliefs that go along with internalized shame is the psychological term, the general term that non-professionals use is toxic shame. It's when it starts in childhood, and you sometimes think you're a failure, or that you're not pretty enough, you're not attractive enough, and just generally not enough in some way, that you're defective, that you're a bad person, you're not a good person, that you hate yourself. Some people have the imposter syndrome, and they think that they're a phony. They don't deserve happiness. The core is that you feel unlovable, or that you don't matter in some way. And those are both inferred or taught to you by your parents. So, so people can go into what I call shame spirals, where they withdraw and ruminate, that you might not realize that you're in it. But if you keep going over something that happened and you're in a lot of negative self-talk, it can lead to just spiral down. I call it the well of shame. You just like, the longer you're in it, the deeper you go, and then you get further and further from reality, just lost in this negative thinking. You start replaying the events. You start maybe feel like a victim. It can lead to depression, despair, just there's emptiness underneath. And sometimes clients will come to me and they'll say, well, I've been in a mood, I've just been down. They don't know why, but when we track it, it's usually either something that happened in an interaction with someone else. But the thing about internalized shame is it doesn't need another person. I mean, you could look in the mirror and or not be able to fit into some clothes, or make a mistake on something, or not deliver some project in time, and you can just shame yourself and go down this like spiral of shame. It's very internalizing. So one of the tips is to get out of that is to externalize your focus. You know, look at something beautiful, play with a pet or a child, or get out, share it with other people, as I said, but get out of your own head. That's a dangerous territory, as they say. So toxic or internalized shame starts in childhood. And there may be voices or images that come to you, words that you learned in your childhood. It could be unconscious. So a lot of people don't realize they have shame. And I didn't for a long time. It came to me in a dream. But then if they make a mistake, or they're seeing their flaws come out, especially in public, they just feel like mortified. And it doesn't just like roll off their back. And that's because it's tapping into deeper unconscious shame. But you don't have to know that you had a dysfunctional upbringing in your childhood. A lot of people think that their childhood was happy or was healthy. And as I said, you don't need an external trigger. You can just do it yourself. And as I said, it can magnify ordinary shame. So, and then you go into these spirals that instead of maybe an hour of feeling like embarrassed or ashamed, it can go on for days, weeks, months. And the worst part is, not only that can cause loneliness and depression and other codependent symptoms, but it leads to shame anxiety. And I'm going to say more about that, but that's really the fear of experiencing shame. So codependents do a lot of behaviors that are all designed to avoid shame anxiety. And a lot of the anxiety that they feel is really shame anxiety. So they don't want to get into a situation where they'll be exposed. All the shame they feel about themselves will be revealed. And so there's defenses to shame. And I mentioned withdrawal. So codependents hide who they are so they won't be seen. So it leads to a lot of dysfunctional communication, makes intimacy impossible. And then denial, as I said, people don't even realize it. So that's a defense. Projecting. So we all have this internal critic, and it can be very harsh when we have a lot of shame. And codependents have a harsh inner critic. It's always judging them, what they did or what they're going to do, a lot of shoulds, how they should behave, always comparing themselves to that ideal. And then they can project it outward. So they think that other people are judging them, which, 99% of the time is not true. So they think that people are judging them the way they judge themselves. The other way it can be projected is that they will judge others the way they judge themselves. So for instance, if you're very conscious about your weight, you might judge other people who are overweight. So, and abusers do this all the time. I have a blog on their favorite weapon, and narcissists and a lot of abusers will project their own shame about themselves, about which they're unconscious because it's repressed, and they'll see it in others. They'll accuse others of what they're doing. So be wary and don't absorb like a sponge everything that's said to you. So humor is a healthy defense, so you can make light of it. And I mentioned perfectionism. Envy is also a defense. So you want what somebody has because you feel that you're missing that, you feel inadequate. And then avoidance with addiction, or avoiding relationships or avoiding topics. And I mentioned aggression. So here's a diagram of how this weak self that's insecure because of shame and trauma in childhood manifests in codependent symptoms. So there's that critical self that surrounds the real self that now is not being expressed, not feeling secure because of trauma and shame. So it's weaker, and we may not even be in touch with this. That's a definition of codependency. We're so focused outside of ourselves. So we lack autonomy and we become dependent on other people. We have issues with intimacy. We're either avoidant, or we can't reveal ourselves, or we're fearful of being seen, or we're pursuing someone that's unavailable. So this is a whole lot of examples of attachment disorders that come from codependency. And one way to heal an attachment disorder is to heal your codependency. So this critical self leads to, I mentioned, shame and guilt and fear that goes along with anxiety and low self-esteem, and it can lead to depression. It can also lead to symptoms of control and caretaking behaviors, trying to rescue somebody else, because then we're like, I call it the top dog. So we don't have to reveal ourselves. We're in control. We feel self-sufficient because we don't want to be vulnerable, and we don't want to expose ourselves, and we don't want to have to share ourselves. So we can focus on someone else to rescue, or we can control people because we think what we know is better and we're arrogant. And it comes from feeling less than about ourselves. So if we don't accept ourselves, it's hard to accept others. And then we have poor boundaries as a result of it. We'll allow people to shame us. We won't put up boundaries around that. We'll absorb other people's feelings. We feel responsible for them. That's all a sign of poor boundaries. And I mentioned denial and dysfunctional on the bottom. I don't know if you can see it's dysfunctional communication, because we can't make I statements. We may not even be in touch with our feelings or our needs because they've been shamed. So to have a healthy communication, and that leads to intimacy, we have to be able to own our feelings, our needs, and express them. So a core feeling of shame and codependency is fear. So what if I'm rejected? And that comes from shame too. What if I end up alone? What if I fail? I'm going to be judged by someone else, or you're afraid of being hurt because you've been so hurt and abandoned in the past. Some people even are afraid of success because then they'll have more attention on themselves, or maybe they've been told that they'll never succeed, or they don't want to go beyond what their family was. And then another fear often is, if I get too close to someone, my codependency will lead me to lose myself. And people that are new in recovery, then they become counter-dependent, and then they become avoidant of relationships because they're afraid of being codependent again, that they'll get trapped in a relationship, an unhealthy relationship, and they don't trust themselves to set boundaries and get out of a bad relationship. And then guilt, I mentioned, is like afraid of making mistakes. Codependents are always saying, I'm sorry. They think they shouldn't feel the way they should. Why am I still grieving this relationship? They're always judging themselves. They do more than 50% of the work in a relationship or in their job. They're always having to do more because they think what they're doing is not enough. And they feel responsible for other people and their problems. And I mentioned dependency. So they need someone else to feel whole. And it leads to obsessions and this anxious attachment because they're afraid of losing a relationship. They're afraid of what the other person thinks. They're fearing abandonment. And a core symptom of codependency is this lack of autonomy, and it leads to difficulty because of the definition. It's inherent in the definition that there's this external locus of control. So especially with women, they lack agency by themselves. So women like to do things in partnership, or they're great on a job or in a class, or if they have a mentor, but just left to themselves, they have no mojo. It's just hard for them to motivate themselves and to take action because they're so used to being in relating to someone. Sometimes they'll know what they want or don't want in a relationship because then they have something to kind of bounce off of. But left to themselves, it's hard to make decisions. So what can happen because of emotional abandonment in childhood, and I don't have time to go into a lot of that, it's all in my book on Conquering Shame, but in early childhood where you didn't feel like you were really accepted or your needs and feelings were shamed or not met, you develop this feelings of shame and insecurity that you're not important, you're not lovable for who you are, you become afraid of intimacy and being seen, and then you end up in these relationships with people who are either unavailable or people who are abusive. So these are abandoning relationships. And then even if you get out of that relationship, you're afraid of repeating it. And then you have more fear of intimacy because now you're hesitant, you're afraid of getting hurt, and it leads to this cycle of abandonment, more fear of intimacy, more fear of connection, and then you get more abandoning relationships. And you want to reverse that and to overcome your codependency and feel secure in yourself. So I mentioned dysfunctional communication. So some symptoms are giving advice, being indirect, what do you want to do? Not answering a question, yes or no, beating around the bush, always apologizing, difficulties saying no. We know it's a complete sentence. Avoiding I statements and blaming and judging, not taking responsibility. For years, I was in Al-Anon for decades, and for many years, I could never take responsibility for anything. And then finally, like after working the steps and knowing that it was okay to have flaws and make mistakes, I was able to take responsibility. So rather than avoiding. So when you say to someone, you're being inconsiderate, that's judging. That's not an I statement. It's learning a whole new language, and it's really difficult. It could take really years to do and a lot of practice. That's why I wrote an ebook and have a webinar on assertiveness. And that's the talk I gave for She Recovers. So instead of blaming and judging someone else, you would say, well, I feel ignored. I feel unimportant. I feel like my needs don't matter to you. And codependents typically ask a lot of questions rather than making statements because they don't want to take a position. So then they feel like they're at risk of being judged. And as I mentioned, the shame anxiety makes us want to hide and being afraid of being seen, being close, and being authentic. Authenticity is the antithesis to shame. So shame makes us want to hide or attack, and authentic is just being real and, being who you are and overcoming that fear of rejection and abandonment that shame anxiety breeds. And when you have this anxiety, it's difficult to be honest. It's difficult to be vulnerable. It limits your ability to try new things because you don't want to look foolish or be spontaneous and playful. So you end up being rigid and controlling yourself or controlling others. And you're just walking you don't have to be in a relationship with someone else to walk on eggshells. Like you're on eggshells in the relationship with yourself. So I always say the relationship with yourself needs to be healed because that's the template for all your relationships. So what are the steps to recovery? First is coming out of denial. Realizing so many people come to me and say, I know someone who's really codependent. What can I do to help them? Or my partner is codependent. How can I help her? But it usually takes two. So looking at yourself, I was married to an alcoholic, and for a long time, I just thought he was the problem. and if he would just shape up. And it's not just denial of codependency, but denial of feelings, denial of needs, denial of wants, denial of our trauma. So there's a lot that needs to be, we have to peel the onion. Letting go of others, because if we're too focused on someone else, we can't do the healing work with ourselves. We won't take responsibility. We'll feel like a victim and blame others. So then building self-esteem means really honoring our needs, our feelings, our wants, and developing assertive communication so then we can express them. And healing our past. And I think a boundaries setting is like graduate course assertiveness, because there's a lot of steps in just being assertive. First of all, feeling like we have rights and overcoming our fears of being seen, and taking positions, learning the language, how to make I statements, and take positions, and then really risking alienating someone by setting a boundary and saying no. And this is my bottom line. And then most of us didn't have tenderness and healthy nurturing coming from dysfunctional families. And that's more than just being told I love you or meeting your material needs. It means really comforting yourself. And years ago when I was told, well, I have to learn how to love myself, I just resented that because I was clueless of like, I knew how to love somebody else. I had no idea what that meant. And I made a self-love meditation for people to learn the language and internalize how to talk to yourself in a gentle, nurturing, like you might to a puppy. You know, some people are so loving with their animals and so harsh and judging of themselves. And then it's important to find pleasure, have a support system. You all have each other, and she recovers, but also develop hobbies and interests. So a relationship is not the focus of your life. And know that you can survive if it ends, because they all end, either whether it's a breakup, divorce, or death, you know. So we have to develop that relationship and confidence in ourselves. And then pursue your larger goals. Take that self-esteem into the world. And now you feel strong enough to share yourself with others. Some goals every day is just to do things that make you build your self-esteem, learn something new, meet your goals for the day, and keep commitments to yourself. And watch how you talk to yourself. I tell people, write down all your negative self-talk and pay attention, because you can't change it if it's unconscious. And then start taking reasonable risks. And if you're in a bad mood or something, ask yourself, what do I need? And meet your needs. Some of the ABCs of self-esteem is, as I said, act to meet your needs. Be authentic. These are all things I've said before, and cultivate this positive internal dialogue. Your unconscious believes what you say just as much as praise or compliments for someone else. So you can do that to yourself all day long, and then do what you really want. A lot of people have trouble identifying what they want. They're so focused on someone else or their own healing and their trauma and their pain that finally, when they feel better, they don't know what they want. And they lack the agency to go after it. So I list some 5 A's of recovery: be authentic, learn to be autonomous, assertive, acceptance of yourself and others, and align, be congruent, align your words, deeds, feelings, and values. In a way, it's integrating. You could think of the word integrity. So you walk your talk, you're whole, and you're not hiding, you're not saying one thing and doing something else. So at the end, I'll just go over my products or books for you. If people have some questions, or I could do that now. So.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, so Conquering Shame and Codependency was published by Hazelden, and 1/3 of it is a workbook and a lot of steps you can follow. First book was Codependency for Dummies, which also is a workbook. And then all my ebooks are ways to recover. So I mentioned how to speak your mind to become assertive, and then overcoming self-criticism is 10 steps to self-esteem. And then I have spiritual transformation and the 12 steps, which is also a workbook. It's for any 12-step program, it doesn't matter. And even if you're agnostic or atheist, but it integrates psychological and spiritual principles a la Carl Jung. And it's a workbook that you can use. And Daily Reflections is just a daily reader with links in it. And then Dealing with a Narcissist, and Overcoming Perfectionism, Freedom from Guilt, which I mentioned. And I have 3 webinars. These are all, the ebooks, by the way, are on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Smashword, and also on my website. The 2 paperbacks are only on online sellers, not sold by me. The webinars and audio files are only on my website, whatiscodependency.com. And one on self-esteem and assertiveness, and then healing shame. This one is actually for professionals, but you can listen to it if you like. And then on my website, I have 2, but whatiscodependency.com and my name. They have links to my YouTube channel, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and I have a lot of audio talks and podcasts on my media page, but you can find them on SoundCloud and Clipit, CLYP.IT. It's also linked on my website. So just I'll open it up to questions now.
Love to see you in our other groups. And Darlene, I really just want to thank you for taking time out of your very busy practice and life to be here with us. And I just think it's so, we didn't plan to wear matching braids today, but
I know.
Pretty cute. So thank you again. And I'm sure we'll have you back sometime in the future to just dive in a little further.
Thank you so much.
I have, this book was actually, it was one of the advanced uncorrected proofs that I received from Hazelden. So I was lucky to have that. And all right.
I want to thank
thanks everybody
for participating in your great questions.
Thanks so much, Darlene.
Okay.